Hello there, welcome to HFY Sci-Fi Galaxy, where humans face the unknown, outsmart the impossible, and turn every test into victory. So sit back and let the story begin.
Nobody clapped when Rami Osei walked through the doors of the Galactic Archive station. Nobody even looked up. The station was the most important cultural building in the known galaxy. It floated in deep space, far from any star system, built on neutral ground so that no species could claim ownership. Inside its endless corridors and reading halls, the sacred texts of over 6,000 civilizations were stored, studied, and protected. Monks, scholars, philosophers, and theologians from every corner of the galaxy came here to read, to argue, and to search for meaning. And then there was Rami, a human, the first one ever assigned to the archive. He carried a single bag over his shoulder. He was 34 years old, average height, average build, with dark skin and calm eyes that took in everything without reacting to any of it. He had been a linguist and cultural researcher back on Earth, the kind of man who spent years reading religious texts from every tradition he could find. The kind of man people forgot was in the room. That was exactly why they sent him. Not because anyone thought he would accomplish something great. The assignment was part of a minor diplomatic clause buried deep in a trade agreement between Earth and the Galactic Council. The Council required a human cultural representative at the archive. Earth's government picked Rami because he volunteered and because nobody else wanted the job. Director Sorvin was waiting for him at the entrance to the lower levels. Sorvin was Drellhurry, tall, thin, with a hard exoskeleton that clicked when he moved and compound eyes that reflected light like polished glass. He ran the archive with absolute authority, and he did not hide his feelings about the new arrival. "You will be given a workspace on level 12, Sorvin said, already walking. It is below the main reading halls. You will have access to the general scripture database only. You will not enter restricted areas. You will not disrupt the work of senior scholars. Do you understand?" "Yes," Rami said. Sorvin paused and turned one of his compound eyes toward him. He seemed almost disappointed that there was no argument. "Good. Your monitor will meet you there." The workspace on level 12 was a small room with a single desk, a reading screen, and a chair designed for a species with a very different spine. Rami adjusted it as best he could and sat down. The walls were bare. The lighting was dim. It felt like a storage closet that someone had emptied in a hurry. His monitor arrived 20 minutes later. Her name was Lura, and she was Fanathi, small, amphibian, with smooth blue-green skin and forearms that moved independently. She looked at Rami the way someone looks at a chore they have been unfairly assigned. "I am here to assist you with basic archive functions," she said. Her tone made it clear she considered this far beneath her abilities. "The reading screen operates by touch. Categories are organized by species, era, and theological branch. Do you need me to explain what theology means?" "No," Rami said. "Thank you." Lura blinked her wide, dark eyes. "Fine. I will be in the corridor if you need anything simple explained." She left. Rami turned to the screen and opened the database. 6,000 species, millions of texts, creation myths, moral codes, hymns, prayers, prophecies, funeral songs, and philosophical arguments stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. It was the largest collection of meaning ever assembled. Rami selected the first text, the Drellhari Canticles, the sacred origin songs of his host species. He began to read. He did not skim. He did not skip to summaries or key passages. He read every word, slowly and carefully, the way someone listens to a song they are hearing for the first time. When he finished, he opened his personal journal and made a few quiet notes. Then he selected the next text, by the end of the first day. He had completed 3 full scriptures from 3 different species. Lura checked on him before the station's rest cycle. She expected to find him frustrated, bored, or confused. Instead, she found him exactly where she had left him, reading with the same calm focus. His journal opened beside him with lines of neat handwriting. "You're still reading?" she asked. "Yes. Those texts are meant to take weeks of study." "I understand," Rami said, "but I would like to read more of them first. I think it helps to hear many voices before deciding what any single one is saying." Lura did not know what to say to that. She told him the lights would dim in 10 minutes and left. Rami read for another 9 minutes. Then he closed the screen, sat back in his uncomfortable chair, and looked at the bare walls of his tiny workspace. Somewhere above him, hundreds of the galaxy's finest minds were debating the meaning of existence in grand halls built for the purpose. Down here, a human nobody had asked for sat alone with a journal and a reading screen, doing the only thing he had ever been good at. Listening, he turned off the light and let the silence settle around him like an old blanket. Tomorrow he would read more. And the day after that. And the day after that. He was in no rush. The galaxy had been writing for a very long time, and Rami Osei had always been a patient man. 3 weeks passed, and the archive forgot about Rami Osei, the way a river forgets a small stone dropped into its current. Scholars came and went through the grand reading halls above. Debates echoed through vaulted corridors lined with scripture carved into living crystal. Theologians from a dozen species argued about the meaning of a single word in a text older than most star systems. This was the rhythm of the archive, slow, proud, and endlessly sure of its own importance. And 12 levels below all of that, Rami read the Fanathi water hymns, which described the universe as an ocean that dreamed itself awake. He read the Grothin War Psalms, which said creation was an act of violence and all life was born from conflict. He read the Vorin Silence Prayers, which argued that truth could only exist in the spaces between words. He read the Tolhari Sun Chants, the Bikari Dust Scriptures, the Mellow Wine Spiral Verses, and hundreds more that he did not sleep much. He ate when Lura reminded him to. He filled journal after journal with notes, not summaries, but connections. Lines drawn between ideas, separated by thousands of light years and millions of years of evolution. Lura, despite every intention to ignore him, could not stop watching. She had started tracking his reading pace during the second week, mostly out of boredom. By the end of the third week, she had stopped pretending it was casual. The numbers did not make sense. Rami had read more individual scriptures than most senior scholars completed in a standard career. Not skimmed. Read. She could tell because he referenced specific passages, specific phrases, specific metaphors buried deep in text that even specialists rarely finished. She reported the numbers to Director Sorvin during a routine check-in. The Sorvin's compound eyes reflected her face back at her in dozens of tiny copies. Reading quickly is not the same as understanding, he said. Humans process information in a shallow, linear way. Their brains are not built for theological depth. He is probably memorizing words without grasping meaning, like a machine copying data. Lura nodded, but she did not fully believe it anymore. The mockery from other scholars was less subtle. A group of Drelhari academics passed Rami in a corridor one afternoon, and one of them said, loudly enough to be heard, "Perhaps the human thinks the scriptures are picture books." The others clicked their mandibles in laughter. A Grothin philosopher, a massive creature with stone-gray skin and 4 heavy legs, stopped by Rami's workspace out of curiosity. He looked at the tiny human sitting at his tiny desk and said, "Your species has existed for the blink of an eye. You do not have the spiritual depth to understand what is written here." This is not an insult. It is simply a fact of biology. Rami looked up and said, "You may be right." The Grothin left, satisfied. Rami went back to reading, but Lura had started asking questions. Small ones at first. What was he working on? What did he find interesting? She told herself it was part of her monitoring duties. One evening, she asked him about the Fanathi water hymns, her own people's sacred text. She expected him to say something polite and vague, the way outsiders always did when discussing another species' religion. Instead, Rami set down his journal and said, "There is a passage in the third cycle of the water hymns where the first current speaks about losing itself in order to become the sea. The language is almost identical to a meditation in the Vorin silence prayers, the one about the voice that must stop speaking to become the song. I think they're describing the same experience of surrender, but through completely different senses. Water for your people, sound for the Vorin." Lura stared at him. That is not possible. The Fanathi and the Vorin developed on opposite sides of the galaxy. There is no cultural exchange between us. There never has been. I know, Rami said. That is what makes it interesting. Lura went back to her own workstation that night and pulled up both texts. She placed them side by side on her screen and read them carefully, one line at a time. The Fanathi original on the left, the Voron translation on the right. The parallel was there. It was not vague or forced. It was specific, structural, and unmistakable. Two completely unrelated species, separated by everything that could possibly separate two civilizations, had arrived at the same spiritual truth using the same narrative shape. And no Fanathi scholar had ever noticed it. No Voron monk had ever pointed it out. In the entire history of the Galactic Archive, with all its resources and all its brilliant minds, nobody had placed these two texts next to each other and seen what a quiet human on level 12 had seen in his third week. Lura sat very still for a long time. The reading screen glowed in the dark room. Her four hands rested flat on the desk. Motionless for the first time all day, she did not tell anyone what she had found. Not yet. She needed to think about what it meant. Not just for the texts, but for every assumption she had made about the man reading them 0.12 levels below the galaxy's greatest minds. Something was happening, and nobody above was paying attention. The weekly scholarly forum at the Galactic Archive was not a place for small ideas. It was held in a vast circular chamber with seating that rose in tiers like the inside of a shell. Hundreds of scholars gathered every cycle to present findings, challenge theories, and defend positions their species had held for centuries. Reputations were built and broken in this room. Rami Osei had never set foot inside it. He stood outside the chamber doors now, holding a small data tablet and breathing slowly. Lura stood beside him, her four arms crossed in a way that could have been support or anxiety. Probably both. He had submitted his request to present 3 days ago. Director Sorvin had tried to deny it, but archive protocol was clear. Any assigned researcher could request a forum slot once per quarter. Sorvin could not block it without violating the rules he himself enforced. So he approved it, and then made sure Rami was scheduled last, after 6 other presentations, when the audience would be tired and impatient. Rami did not mind. He was used to being last. The doors opened. He walked in. The chamber was enormous and filled with beings of every shape and size. Drelhari scholars clicked quietly in their elevated seats. Growth and philosophers sat like boulders in the lower rows. Fanathi archivists clustered together near the middle. Voron monks occupied a silent section near the back, their hooded forms perfectly still. Rami walked to the central platform. It was designed for speakers twice his size. He looked very small, standing there. "My name is Rami Osei," he said. His voice was calm and carried well in the acoustic chamber. "I am a human cultural representative assigned to level 12. Over the past 6 weeks, I have read approximately 10,000 scriptures from the archive's general database." A murmur went through the crowd. Some of it was surprise. Most of it was doubt. "I would like to share one observation." He activated his data tablet and projected 14 texts onto the chamber's display screens. They were from 14 different species with no shared history, no trade routes, no diplomatic contact, and no common ancestry. 14 civilizations that had never spoken a word to each other. Each of these texts, in its oldest known version, contains a parable, Rami said. The details differ. The characters change. The settings are unique to each culture. But the structure is identical. In every version, there is a light, described differently by each species, that chooses to become darkness. Not because it is destroyed, not because it fails. It chooses to become darkness so that other beings can learn to see. He paused and let the words settle. A light that becomes darkness to teach sight. 14 species. 14 versions. 0 contact between them. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then the chamber erupted that a Drelhari theologian stood and declared that the Canticle of First Shadow was an original Drelhari composition, and any similarity to lesser texts was coincidence. A Grothan war priest slammed one of his massive fists on the stone armrest and said the human was twisting sacred words to fit a primitive theory. A Fanathi elder spoke rapidly about cultural contamination and flawed translation methods point one by one. Scholars from each of the 14 species stood to defend their version as the original and dismiss the others as echoes or errors. Rami did not argue. He stood on the platform and let them speak. He had expected this. Every species looked at their own scripture and saw themselves. That was the problem he was trying to describe, and they were proving it in real time without realizing it. Director Sorvin rose last. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. "This forum is for serious scholarly work," he said, "not for primitive pattern matching from an unqualified visitor. The human has demonstrated exactly why his species was given a workspace on level 12 and not in the main halls. I recommend we move on." The chamber settled. A few scholars nodded. Most simply looked away from Rami as though he had already disappeared. He picked up his data tablet and walked out. Lura was waiting in the corridor. She said nothing. She walked beside him back to level 12, matching his pace, which was steady and unhurried despite everything. "Are you all right?" she finally asked. "Yes," Rami said. "I did not expect them to agree." "Then why did you present?" "Because now they have heard it. It will sit in their minds whether they want it to or not." That night, 3 scholars from the forum independently accessed the 14 texts Rami had cited. They did it quietly from private terminals, making sure no colleagues could see their screens. They cross-referenced the passages he had identified. They checked his translations. They compared the structures. He was right. Every single connection held. None of them said a word about it publicly. But on level 12, something else happened. A figure appeared at the entrance to Rami's workspace just before the rest cycle dimmed the lights. He was tall, draped in layered gray robes, with a face that was mostly smooth bone and 2 deep-set eyes that glowed faintly amber. Brother Hotho. A Vorin monk, one of the guardians of the archive's most restricted collection, but he did not speak. He walked into the room, sat on the floor near Rami's desk, and stayed there for 1 hour in perfect silence. Then he stood, dipped his head once, and left. Rami watched him go. Then he turned back to his reading screen and opened the next text. Whatever was coming, it had not arrived yet. But it was closer now. The sealed chamber had no door. It had a wall that opened only when a Vorin monk pressed both hands against it and spoke a prayer so old that even the monk did not fully understand the words. Brother Hotho stood before that wall now, with Rami beside him. The corridor was deep inside the archive's restricted core, far below even level 12, in a section most scholars had never visited. The air was cooler here. The lights were dim and amber, casting long shadows that moved like living things. "I have watched you," Hotho said. His voice was deep and slow, like stones settling at the bottom of a river. "For 3 days I sat near your workspace and observed how you read. You do not read the way others do." "How do others read?" Rami asked. "They search for confirmation. They open a text already knowing what they want to find, and they find it, and they close the text satisfied. You open a text with nothing. You let it fill you. That is why you see what they cannot." Hotho pressed his hands to the wall. He spoke the prayer. The stone split silently down the middle and slid apart, revealing a chamber lit by a pale blue glow that came from the walls themselves. "These are the sealed texts," Hotho said. "The oldest scriptures in the known galaxy. They were ancient before my species learned to build fires. No scholar has ever been able to reconcile them. They appear to contradict each other so completely that most theologians believe they prove the universe has no single truth." Rami stepped inside. The chamber was smaller than he expected, round with a low ceiling, and every surface was covered. The texts were not digital. They were physical, carved into dark stone tablets, etched into sheets of metal so thin they were almost transparent, woven into fabric that shimmered with a light of its own. Written in languages that had no living speakers, no known descendants, no connection to any civilization that still existed. There were 11 of them. Rami moved slowly from one to the next, not touching, just looking. Each one radiated a weight that had nothing to do with mass. These were the words of beings so old that the galaxy had forgotten their names. "Director Sorvin knows I brought you here," Hotho said. He filed a formal objection. But a Voron's spiritual sponsorship cannot be overridden by administrative authority. It is one of the oldest protections in archive law. He was very angry. I imagine he was, Rami said, still looking at the texts. He called you a waste of resources. He is not the first. Hatho almost smiled. It was difficult to tell with Voron faces, but something shifted in the bone structure around his mouth. I will leave you now. I will return when the rest cycle begins. Lura has offered to bring you food and water. Thank you, Brother Hatho. The monk left. The walls sealed shut behind him, and Rami was alone with the oldest words in existence, that he began with the first tablet, a black stone covered in sharp, angular script. He worked slowly, using the translation tools the archive provided, but also relying on his own instincts. He had spent years on Earth studying dead languages, ancient Sumerian, Sanskrit, Old Egyptian, classical Nahuatl, and he had learned that translation was never just about words. It was about what the writer was feeling when they chose those words over all the others they could have used. Days passed. Lura brought food and sat outside the sealed wall, unable to enter but unwilling to leave. She could hear nothing from inside. The chamber was perfectly soundproofed. When she asked Rami through a communication channel what he was finding, he said, I am not sure yet, but something is here. On the fourth day, she pressed harder. Can you describe it? Rami was quiet for a long time. Then he said, On Earth, I grew up reading the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, Buddhist sutras, the Tao Te Ching, the oral stories of indigenous peoples from 6 continents. I read them not to decide which one was right, but to understand what each one was trying to say. My professors told me I was wasting my time. They said you had to commit to one tradition to understand any of them. Were they wrong? They were right for themselves, but they were wrong about me. I did not need to believe a text to understand it. I just needed to listen without needing it to be mine. Lura processed this, and that is what you are doing with the sealed texts. Yes, every scholar who has entered this chamber came from a species with its own scripture. They read the sealed texts looking for echoes of their own story. When they found contradictions instead, they decided the texts were broken. But the texts are not broken. What are they? Rami paused again, longer this time. When he spoke, his voice was different. Not louder, not more confident, just more certain, in the way that a river is certain of a sea. They are not contradicting each other, Lura. They are telling the same story from different rooms in the same house. 11 witnesses to a single event, each one standing in a different place, each one seeing a different part. If you stop trying to decide which witness is right and instead ask what they all saw together, the full picture appears. What is the full picture? I think it is the story of how consciousness was born. Not for one species, for all of them, for everyone. Lura pressed her 4 hands flat against the corridor wall and felt the cold stone beneath her skin. On the other side, a human was holding 11 impossible truths in his mind at the same time, and none of them were breaking him. She had never met anyone like that. She was not sure anyone in the galaxy had. The Galactic Cultural Conclave had not assembled in full session for 11 years. The last time was to settle a dispute between 2 species who both claimed authorship of the same creation myth. That argument took 6 months to resolve and nearly started a war. Now every seat was filled again. And the reason was a human. The conclave chamber was built at the very heart of the archive station, a space so large it had its own weather patterns. Fog drifted near the ceiling. Light came from bioluminescent panels that shifted color depending on the emotional state of the majority in the room. Right now, the light was a cold, skeptical blue. Rami stood at the center. The speaking platform here was even larger than the one in the weekly forum. He looked like a single dark point in a field of pale stone. Around him, rising in every direction, sat hundreds of the galaxy's most powerful minds. Theologians with centuries of study. Philosophers who had shaped the moral codes of entire civilizations. Monks who had spent lifetimes in silence. Scientists who had mapped the spiritual development of 1,000 species. And at the highest point, in a seat carved from a single piece of crystal, sat High Curator Omnith. He was ancient. His species, the Polari, lived for thousands of years, and Omnith had been old when most of the scholars in this room were born. His body was thin and translucent, and light passed through him as though he were made of colored glass. He had never acknowledged a human in any official capacity. Director Sorvin sat in the administrative section. His mandibles were tight. He had prepared formal objections and filed them in advance. He was ready for this to end badly. Brother Hathos sat with the Vorin delegation, his amber eyes steady and calm. Lura sat alone near the back, her 4 hands gripping the edge of her seat. Rami looked out at the assembly. He did not look nervous. He looked like a man who had been walking a very long road and had finally reached the place where the road ended and the open ground began. "Thank you for allowing me to speak," he said. His voice was carried by the chamber's acoustics to every corner. "I will not take much of your time." He activated the display. The 11 sealed texts appeared, projected in their original forms: the black stone, the thin metal, the shimmering fabric. Every scholar in the room recognized them. Many had spent years trying to decode them individually. "These texts have been called contradictory," Rami said. "For as long as they have been studied, scholars have tried to determine which one is correct and which ones are in error. The assumption has always been that truth is singular. That if one text says consciousness was born from silence and another says it was born from a song, then one must be wrong." He paused. The chamber was completely still. "I believe they're all correct. And I believe the reason no one has seen this before is not because the texts are too difficult. It is because every reader who has entered the sealed chamber brought something with them that made it impossible to see clearly." "And what is that?" The voice came from above. "High Curator Omnith." The chamber's light shifted slightly, turning warmer at his words. "Their own story," Rami said. "Every species in this galaxy has a scripture that tells them who they are and why they matter. It is the foundation of identity. And when a Drelhari scholar reads the sealed texts, they look for the Drelhari truth. When a Vorin monk reads them, they look for the Vorin truth. When any being reads them, they search for themselves. And when they do not find themselves, they call the texts broken." He changed the display. Now the 11 texts were arranged not as separate documents, but as segments of a single narrative, overlapping where their imagery aligned, connecting where their metaphors completed each other. "I am human. My species is not mentioned in any of these texts. We have no ancient claim, no origin myth that connects us to whatever created these words. I had nothing to look for and nothing to protect. So I did the only thing I could do. I read all of them as if they were all true at the same time." He walked through the unified, reading slowly. He showed how the text about silence described the moment before consciousness, how the text about the song described the moment it began, how the text about the fracture described consciousness dividing into separate minds, how each of the 11 texts captured a different stage of the same event, the birth of awareness in the universe, witnessed by 11 ancient civilizations from 11 different angles. When he finished, the chamber was silent. The bioluminescent light had shifted from cold blue to a deep, uncertain gold. Omnith spoke again. "How does a species so young and so small learn to hold so many truths at once?" Rami looked up at the ancient curator. "We had no choice," he said. "Our world gave us thousands of gods, thousands of stories, thousands of truths, all on one small planet where we could never escape each other. We either learned to listen to all of them, or we destroyed ourselves." He paused. "Some days we almost did." Omnith did not smile. His translucent face did not change. But he nodded once, slowly, and the crystal seat he sat upon caught the chamber's golden light and scattered it across the room like stars. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. The silence was not empty. It was full, the way a held breath is full, waiting to become something new. 6 months later, the Galactic Archive Station looked the same from the outside. The same enormous structure floating in neutral space. The same ships arriving and departing. The same quiet hum of a place built to hold the weight of everything every civilization had ever believed. But inside, something had shifted. And it had started on level 12, the tiny workspace where Rami Osei had once sat alone in a converted storage closet was empty now. not because he had left, but because he had been moved. The conclave, in a decision that passed with only 3 objections, had approved the construction of a new wing, the Comparative Scripture Wing, dedicated to the cross-species study of shared theological patterns. It was the first new wing added to the archive in 40 years. Rami's desk sat near a wide window that looked out into open space. The chair was designed for a human spine. The room was large enough for visitors, and there were many. Scholars came from across the galaxy to work with him, not because he was the smartest being in the archive. He was not. Not because he had the most experience. He had decades, less than most of the theologians who now sought his advice. They came because he could do something that none of them could do alone, that he could read without walls, that a Drellhari musicologist came to understand how the harmonic structures in her species' hymns mirror the mathematical prayers of the Bikari, a species her people had never contacted. A Grothan historian came to explore why his culture's oldest war chant contained a passage about mercy that did not appear in any later Grothan text, but appeared, almost word for word, in a Fanathi lullaby. A Tolhari sun priest came simply to sit with Rami and ask how it was possible to believe in everything and nothing at the same time. Rami answered that question the same way every time. I do not believe in everything, he would say. I listen to everything. Those are different things. Lura had become his research partner. She no longer introduced herself as his monitor. She had published 3 papers of her own, each one exploring connections between Fanathi spirituality and the traditions of species the Fanathi had never met. Her work was controversial among her own people. Some Fanathi elders called it disrespectful to suggest their sacred texts shared anything with alien writings. But younger Fanathi scholars were reading her papers with wide eyes and open minds, and Lura knew that was enough. She and Rami had developed a working rhythm that felt effortless. She organized. He read. She challenged. He listened. She spoke quickly with all 4 hands moving. He spoke slowly with his hands still. They were nothing alike, and that was exactly why they worked. Brother Hatho visited every few days. He and Rami would sit together for an hour, sometimes in silence, sometimes exchanging a few words about a passage or a thought. Hatho had begun his own project, translating Rami's unified reading of the sealed texts into the Vorin contemplative tradition, so that his monks could study it in their own way. He said it was the most meaningful work he had done in 200 years. Director Sorvin had not apologized. Rami did not expect him to, and did not need him to, but something had changed in the director as well. Lura noticed it first. Sorvin's objections to the comparative wing had grown quieter over time, then stopped entirely. One night, a maintenance worker mentioned seeing Sorvin alone in his office, reading something on his personal screen with unusual focus. Lura checked the access logs the next morning. Sorvin had been reading one of Rami's cross-reference papers, the one about the parable of the light that becomes darkness. That he had read it twice. The biggest change came from beyond the archive. Word of Rami's work had spread through diplomatic channels, academic networks, and even popular media across dozens of star systems. And it had created an unexpected demand. Alien scholars began requesting copies of human religious texts, not human technology, not human weapons, not human science. They wanted the Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the Tao Te Ching, the Pali Canon, the Book of the Dead, the oral traditions of indigenous peoples from 6 continents, the poetry of Rumi, the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the koans of Zen Buddhism. They wanted to understand how one species on one small planet had produced thousands of different answers to the same questions that every civilization in the galaxy had only ever answered once. Rami watched a new delegation arrive through the window of his office. They were carrying translated copies of human texts in their hands, held carefully the way someone holds something they do not yet understand but already respect. He thought about Earth, about the Crusades and the Inquisitions and the Holy Wars, about temples burned and mosques destroyed and churches built on the ruins of older gods, about all the blood spilled over words written by people who only wanted to make sense of being alive. The cost of having so many truths had been enormous. He carried that weight every day, but the gift of it was this: A man could sit in a room full of impossible contradictions and not break. A man could hold 11 ancient truths in his mind and let them speak to each other instead of demanding that they fight. A man could read 10,000 scriptures and hear, beneath all the different words, the same quiet voice saying the same quiet thing. You are not alone. You were never alone that a young alien student appeared at his door. She was small, bird-like, with bright feathers and nervous eyes. She asked him the question everyone eventually asked. What is the most important scripture in the galaxy? Rami thought about it. He looked at his shelves, filled with texts from species he had never met and worlds he would never visit. He looked at the stars outside his window. He looked at the student's bright, waiting eyes. The one you have not read yet, he said. The student smiled and left. Rami turned back to his desk, where a new text was waiting. A scripture from a species recently discovered on the edge of known space, their first contribution to the archive. Nobody had read it yet. He opened the first page and began.